Hello, and welcome to the CannAtlantic Conference, the country's first mid-Atlantic cannabis conference, brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this particular session, this session is about media reparations for the Black communities. And this is a very important conversation as we talk about how does media cover cannabis legalization, what perspectives, voices, and expertise are being left out of coverage, and what does reparations mean for people and communities who often are underserved, overlooked, underreported, and where the information is not properly and adequately reaching them to have them become more civically and politically engaged to change the environments, change the systems, and change their neighborhoods and communities for the better. Talking about this important work is Free Press Collette Watson, who is the Vice President of Cultural Strategy at Free Press. She's going to talk to us about media reparations, about free press, and the ongoing work that it takes to inform Black communities with proper information. Collette, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate having you on and having this really important conversation.
Thank you, Tahid. I'm so honored to be a part of this conference, and I appreciate you.
And for full transparency, I am also an employee of Free Press, and I am very hyped about the Media 2070 project that's going to be coming out from Free Press, which is talking exactly about media reparations for Black communities. So Collette, we'll just have you give viewers a little bit more background information. Tell people who you are, tell people about Free Press, and tell people about this media reparations project that you've been working on, you and a team of people at Free Press have been working on, that y'all are ready to launch soon.
Absolutely. Well, you have stated it already, but my name is Collette Watson. I'm originally from the occupied indigenous territory known as South Carolina. I come from Gullah Geechee people down in the low country there, which means that I love rice. And that's where I hail from. And I come from a community that was very much steeped in Black pride and love and joy and dignity. And that is the way that I pursue media and technology justice. From the frame of understanding its historical harm of our lives and our self-determination and righting those wrongs. And so for me, our project known as Media 2070, which is just about to launch here at the very beginning of October, it is my life's work in many, many ways. Media 2070 is our vision of what media could be in the year 2070, 50 years from now. And not just our vision of what it could be, but our vision of how we get there. And we believe very strongly that how we get there is to name, acknowledge, and begin to repair the harms that the United States media system has done against Black people and communities. Now, it's funny because in this country, when you talk about slavery, the original sin, the enslavement of kidnapped African folks in this country, it becomes a lightning rod, which, is a little bit confusing because we all know it happened, but that's fine. So when you see a project such as the one that was released last year by New York Times, the 1619 Project, now here in 2020 being literally illegalized in many ways by the Trump administration, you understand just how fundamental this idea of narrative is to the idea of power and control. And so when we talk about racism normally, and when we talk about anti-Blackness in this country, we think of policing, we think of economic justice, poverty, opportunity, and maybe even as of late, we've begun to think a little bit about healthcare with the rising conversation around Black maternal health, certainly around the ways that we medicate, and the ways that we have people being sort of, I feel anyway, kind of goaded into dependency on chemicals in many of the ways that cannabis prohibition has affected our communities. But we don't often talk about media. We think of media as just being this neutral reflection of society, a literal mirror, right? A piece of glass that if you just walked up to it, your mirror has never really expressed a perspective, probably. It's kind of like the one in the fairy tale of Snow White is sort of the fantasy, but in reality, we know and understand that mirrors don't have a perspective. And we oftentimes, we've positioned media in this country as though it exists to reflect society, to tell the truth, right? Through this idea of objectivity and neutrality. But in reality, media is a system that is upheld by humans, right? And so much in the same way that we talk about algorithms and technology at Free Press and our work on media and technology, this idea of neutrality is false. When you are talking about reporting, you're talking about people who are conducting reporting on histories that are truly shaped by who is in power and who has the right and the capital to tell their own stories. Much in the same way that when you talk about the technology system, algorithms and coding are being performed by and large by people who have refused to acknowledge their own privilege in the histories of this of this country. So, when we talk about media and the fact that the notion of objectivity is false, what we then find is that, and Tahid, you have said this much more eloquently than I, objectivity is really an idea that has been weaponized against particularly journalists of color. I think that's how you said it, Tahid. And I truly, passionately believe in that and appreciate you phrasing it so eloquently, because what it has done is it has taken away our power to shape the narrative around who we are, who we have been historically, how we got to where we are, and what we deserve and what we want, and even who we think we are. It has become, narratives have become internalized in many ways that are harmful. So that's one of the ways that media and the lack of Black power and control of media and media narratives has harmed our lives in terms of who we think we are and what the story is out there about us. But it goes farther than that, because what media has served to do, because of the refusal of media outlets and media makers to acknowledge the realities of privilege and the realities of white controlled and white centeredness, what has happened is that media has instituted and deepened a myth of Black inferiority. And that myth of inferiority creates the conditions of the society that we live in and the society in which policy is made, right? And so when we're talking about police violence, defunding of police, when we're talking about expungement of records, decriminalization, criminalization, et cetera, just so many of the ways that policy comes in and very fundamentally oppresses, exploits, changes the lives of Black people, media is creating the conditions in which we understand what is possible and what is desirable from our policymakers. And it's also creating the conditions through which policymakers can convince us of what we need. What even is public safety? Safety from whom? Safety from what? I would say that if you ask the average Black or Muslim or transgender person on the street, when they feel safe and who is present, 9 times out of 10, the police are not a part of that equation. But we have a society in which the idea of public safety is set up around the idea that police keep us safe. And media goes a long way to reinforcing that notion. When you look at the ways that police are riding along with journalists who are new to the newsroom, the ways that police information officers are providing press releases that often become the single and only source for reports on situations that happen in the community. For instance, the early reporting around the murder of Breonna Taylor, in which she was implicated in drug crime activities that she had nothing to do with, that may not even have occurred in what we're seeing. These are the things that create the conditions in which you see a verdict, like what we saw this week, that create the conditions in which you have people literally blaming a young woman who was sleeping in her bed for her own murder. But how do we get here? And then I'm going to close because I'm going long here, Tahid. But how do we get here, right, is the question. It would be beautiful if we could just say, stop that, and just flip a switch, and media suddenly somehow reflected our lives and stopped exploiting and harassing us in the many ways that it does. But that's not how real life works. What has to happen, we know, in situations of systemic oppression, is that there has to be systemic change, which begins with systemic repair. And so Media 2070, right now in its first phase, is an in-depth essay that we spent a year working on, in which we've compiled various examples of media harm that demonstrate the fact that this idea of Black inferiority as its myth, as its central idea, and even more as its business model is embedded in the very DNA of the United States media system, going all the way back to 1706. One of the first colonial newspapers in Boston was able to stay afloat by engaging in the selling of newspaper ads, advertising for the return of enslaved persons, and even serving as the meetup spot for slaveholders who were looking to conduct their business and negotiations around human trafficking, the trafficking of enslaved African people. That's 1706. That is how far back we're talking. And the history is very deep and long. It goes from then to all the way into the civil rights movement, in which local newspapers and television stations in the South used their outlets to promote the agenda of white citizens councils in advocating for maintaining a segregated caste system throughout the United States. And then coming on forward into the 80s and 90s, the war on drugs, also the exclusion of Black and POC journalists from newsrooms and from certain beats and certain reportings, which we just saw demonstrated with the journalist at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who was removed from reporting on racial uprisings in 2020 because they accused her of being biased because she is Black and chose to spoke on the hypocrisy of the ways that the unrest was being characterized when compared with the ways that total destruction of the community was characterized following a Kenny Chesney concert. So it goes very deep. There are many, many instances, and what we've embarked on with Media 2070 is truly providing the documentation of these histories, the evidence of what we're talking about when we say that the United States media system has directly harmed Black communities since its inception and is a major component of the systemic oppression, systemic racism, and systemic anti-Blackness that we face. But it's not just about documenting. Our goal is, as we continue to uplift this work and as people read this 100-page, give or take, document that we have compiled, that they will begin to add their own stories, because there are untold, examples of media racism and harm. When you go back, well, I'm not going to give more examples, but my point is that we each have testimonies that we hold and that we bear that have been erased, right, systemically, as part of the ways that we are oppressed. And so we're inviting people to join us in a consortium in which we will continue to bear witness, compile these testimonies, and begin to hold accountable the news outlets, the corporations, and the governments that have created the policies and practices of media racism. And so we're asking people to join, to sign up via our sign up page. And I believe that link is coming in a moment, but it's bit.ly/join media 2070, so that you can help us to not only tell the story, but begin to dream of what the repair looks like. Because for us, it's not about coming out with a vision of this is what reparations is. It's about deciding together in community as activists, journalists, media makers, residents, people who hold various histories and stories, what is it that our communities need? And we don't think that that's a blanket solution. We think it's something that takes time, but it first begins with acknowledging the debt.
Rookie mistake as always. Couldn't have said it better myself. When I was first given the rough draft of the original Media 2070 project paper, I was just blown away. I was astounded. And it gave me a chance to really remind myself that so many Black journalists and journalists of color don't have the time to not only engage with some community members who are really thinking about the destructive nature of media and the narratives that are being formed and the information that's being distorted, but also just not giving the space to dream, to think, how can we better cover impacted communities? How can we involve community members in our reporting? How can we fight institutional racism within our own newsrooms to be able to accurately report on these issues that have a whole bunch of nuances behind it and are not led by those in authority or established by authority? The whole point of this cannabis conference is to talk about the fact and remind people who work in media, who work in communications, who work in content creation, that the media had a pivotal role in creating this narrative and changing the public perception over cannabis when cannabis used to be legal, when cannabis used to be grown, when cannabis used to be a fundamental part of our agricultural ecosystem and economy. And the idea is to acknowledge the damage of this misinformation and this disinformation that the media has injected into the public consciousness, and really start to help journalists, media creators, media entrepreneurs, content creators, and anyone who wants to get into the cannabis space to really recognize the harm of the war on drugs and the way that it was perceived and supported, and find ways to make sure that people are informed with scientific facts, with research, with grounded truths that we know existed. But the media, because it was white-centered, white majority, was always narrating toward a specific population that was not Black and not Indigenous or not any community of color as well. So I'm glad that you really made some amazing points about the fact that media has never really been a accurate reflection of the true realities of this country. And it's up to us, journalists, or even anyone who's interested in joining these spaces that touch cannabis or involves cannabis, that we have a duty to talk about the right information and really reverse and repair the harms that have impacted Black communities and other communities of color too. With that being said, what are some things that you're really looking forward to when it comes to launching Media 2070? What do you hope that people ultimately take away from when when this paper comes out? And really, it's a book. I feel like it should say at this point, it's a book.
It is.
When this comes out, when this lands in the hands of Black communities, journalists of color, Black journalists, people in the media industry and outside of it, what do you really hope people take away from reading and digesting what reparations for Black communities means? What do you hope is the ultimate takeaway here?
I hope people have two experiences with the paper, or two takeaways. I hope that there is a very solemn deepening of folks' understanding of just how deep and broad the harm has been against the harm of Black communities that has been wrought by United States media. And when I say media, I'm speaking to the white controlled and centered media system. We do throughout the paper talk also about the media of resistance and the media makers who have resisted and who have been, our heroes in that way. I would count you among them, Tahid. But I do hope that people truly take in the names and the dates of the stories that are shared. We begin the paper, the essay, the book with the story of Eugene Williams in Chicago, who was sailing a raft on the beach and was attacked by white beachgoers and ended up drowning, and how police were called to the scene and ended up arresting the Black people who were on scene, as opposed to the white beachgoers who had attacked him. And this resulted in unrest in the city, and how media reported on that as though Black folks just got violent. And the parallels between that and today. And for me, most deeply, the fact that a young boy, I believe he was 16 years old, lost his life. He was killed that day. His father died about a year later from heart-related causes that I read as a broken heart. His family lost their son. His future was lost to his community. And media then came and said that his life didn't matter, and that Black people in the city, needed to be, for lack of a better characterization, put down, and fueled this perception in a way that contributed to white folks committing acts of violence, Black folks being killed. But something very unique happened. A race relations commission was formed in Chicago to examine how this all happened. And that commission acknowledged the ways that the victim count of white people was overreported, and the story was wielded to justify and sanitize violence against Black people. And so That is something we've seen play out over and over again in history. The 1960s racial uprisings resulted in the creation of a Kerner Commission, which issued a report saying something very similar, but going much deeper and, of course, on the national level in acknowledging how media and the flattened way that Black folks were portrayed as inferior and violent, and not as people who, it mentioned people who have homes and families and go to PTA meetings and have hopes and dreams and futures, was contributing to the restlessness and to the sense of powerlessness and despair that was feeding the unrest in those cities. And so we've seen that play out over and over again. But what I'm hoping is that people will, this time, with this reporting, see that just naming it isn't enough. And that I hope people's takeaway will be that it is time to do something, and doing something means repairing. It's time for repair, and that means reparations.
To wrap up this amazing conversation, sprinkled throughout this cannabis conference, there's going to be opportunities for speakers to talk about what should journalists, media entrepreneurs, content creators, anyone really in the communication space, how can they cover cannabis or other issues that impact Black and Brown communities? How can they better cover these issues? How can they be more inclusive? What are ways that we can ensure that that these important narratives are included in our storytelling?
You know, I often refer back to that viral TED Talk that the author Chimamanda Adichie gave years ago now, where she talked about the danger of a single story. And, you know, and I know we can get into a lot of different things about Chimamanda, but I will just talk about the validity of that idea. But I also need to affirm my own allyship transgender communities in this moment and make sure that it's understood that I don't think any of us are free until particularly transgender Black women, are free. But this idea of a single story to me is so fundamental to what journalists and media makers can do. Because what we have going right now is this idea that journalism does not have to have a power analysis, and that media makers can simply report according to what the experts have to say. And I think we have to disrupt this idea of who is an expert and what is expertise. An expert doesn't just mean, you know, that an entity is incorporated or that a person has a terminal degree. Expertise involves lived experience just as much, if not more, than any of those other types of qualifications. And so we have to begin to open our eyes to the fact that lived experiences of health, of dependency, of you know, the healthcare system, of the pharmaceutical industrial complex, all of these, if we're truly to investigate these entities in society, we have to understand how they show up in people's lives. And that means talking to people. And that means doing something that we're really loath to do in the media industry, and talking to activists. Activists are community members too. And an activist is just as valid in a conversation as a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, or of, you know, a cannabis chain of some sort, or as a police information officer, or an FBI investigator, or a DEA investigator. We have to get away from centering our reporting on these status quo bastions of power that are very representative of our historical racial hierarchy. Because who are the people who have access to the education and the opportunities to even be in those roles, in those institutions of, you know, law enforcement or health or pharma? First of all, right? But even when you have a person of color in those roles, those are still the institutions in many ways that have caused much harm and even oppression in people's lives. So we have to talk to people. We have to decenter law enforcement. We have to decenter corporations and bring parity to whose stories are valid and whose stories are meaningful in determining what really is the truth. And then we have to be really grounded in history. And we have to be grounded in shared histories, not just sort of the propaganda histories that, we sort of get treated to. If you would not talk about the Civil War from the perspective of the Confederates only, you should not be talking about cannabis from the perspective of law enforcement only, or even of lawmakers only. We have to talk about the people whose lives have been impacted. And then we have to put ourselves in those people's shoes, and not just about them, but talk with them. People who have experienced cannabis convictions, people, et cetera, their families, the impacts and the levels of the impacts to their families and their communities as a result of this criminalization. And I think the last thing that we have to do, if we're really going to, to make a difference that is reparative, is we have to start thinking about new ways of even going about the process of gathering news and information. Being in relationship with communities. That's something we talk a lot about at Free Press. My colleague Alicia Bell and my colleague Mike Rispoli train newsrooms on how to truly be in trusting relationship with community, whether it's sitting down for coffee with residents or being in conversation with folks to understand, how does our reporting impact people all along the gender spectrum? How does our reporting impact undocumented folks? And really, truly being able to talk about the stories that relate to those topics in a way that reflects the breadth of experience, and doing that very, very intentionally, not sort of just waiting for those folks to come into the newsroom. Because as anyone who holds an oppressed identity knows, newsrooms, hospitals, banks, government offices, courtrooms, they're all sort of part of the ivory tower of institutions that we stay away from so that we can survive. Because we never know what will happen to us, to our bodies, if we physically put ourselves in a position of proximity to these institutions that have historically represented control of our movements and even possibly loss of our liberty. So we have to understand that as members of the news profession, members of the journalism practice, and realize that we're not the only ones who are holding and keeping and telling stories about communities, and be in partnership with those live streamers and those faith leaders and different people who are keeping and holding oral traditions around different communities, and to really understand the ways and that all of that shapes who has power. And in that way, we begin to shift power, because I think it's important for us to realize that the highest calling of journalism, truly, in my opinion, we talk about speaking truth to power and help, giving a voice to the voiceless. It's now, because we understand historically who is voiceless, so to speak, and why, shifting that power. And what we can do is decenter that status quo those status quo centers of power, and begin to center the communities most impacted, so that power in reality and in the world shifts, and we no longer have a situation where people are rendered voiceless, but instead a situation in which everyone inherently is able to amplify the stories and the truths that they live, so we can really understand what's happening around us.
Collette, I feel like people will be preaching like you are right when they read this Media 2070 paper that drops. I feel like all of this knowledge that you are really instilling to these viewers, that's really baked into the Media Reparations paper. This is all understood. This is all historically analyzed and ingrained and written throughout this paper that's going to be coming out. I'm really excited to see this launch. I'm really happy that you were able to give some time to not just me, but for those who are viewing, to talk about media reparations and then what this vision, what this dream can look like if we're able to work together to implement that. And last but not least, can you just reiterate? You said it a little bit earlier, but can you reiterate to our viewers, how can they get in touch with you, or how can they make sure that they sign up to get the more updates of Media 2070 when it's close to launch?
Absolutely. Firstly, I would say follow us on social media. We're at instagram.com/media.2070. Same thing on Twitter. And then hit our sign up page so that you can join the consortium, which basically is you registering for updates to stay involved and to know when we do have virtual gatherings and things. And that is at bit.ly/join media 2070. And that link is on our Instagram, it's on our Twitter profile. And we just are inviting people to join us in the thinking and the dreaming of what we want to see in 2070. And by hitting bit.ly/join media 2070, you can share your ideas with us and be a part of everything that's coming together.
Collette, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so glad that we were able to have it. Looking forward to seeing the launch of this paper. I'm looking forward to people reading this and providing feedback and implementing some of these ideas into their own communities as well. And really, working more closely and collaboratively with journalists, and with journalists making sure to understand that they need to work with community members to write stories. They need to put these perspectives and the expertise in these stories, and that there's so much power in narratives that can be distributed and shared to the public consciousness through media channels. And so I'm excited. I'm really happy that you were able to stop by and talk to us a little bit about this for the CannAtlantic Conference. I really appreciate your time, Collette.
Of course. Thank you so much.